Okay, guys, so this week we're going to talk about the principles of the Constitution. A principle is kind of like an idea in this case. These are the things they wanted the Constitution to stand for. So I have a mnemonic device. A mnemonic device means you guys have used these before, like PEMDAS, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. That's a mnemonic device. So the one for principles of the Constitution is please let's sign Constitution's faster Rhode Island. And that one works because Rhode Island was the last one to sign the Constitution. But please stands for popular sovereignty, L is for limited government, S for separation of powers, C is for checks and balances, F is for federalism, R is republicanism, and I is individual rights. So we're going to go through a slideshow. I'm not doing them all today. We'll do about half today and we'll finish it on Wednesday. I'll go through the slideshow and talk about each principle of the Constitution to help you understand it a little bit better. So first we have popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is the idea that the people have the power. Popular is people, sovereignty is rule. So the people rule. An example is voting. We vote for who we want to be in charge. That goes back to the preamble of the Constitution. It's found in Article 1 and it's found in the 9th Amendment. The rights and the power lie with the people. So you can see we've crossed out the king because we're ending this idea of a monarchy or one central, completely in charge person. L for limited government. So limited government just is a restriction. When you're limiting something, you're restricting it. So they're limiting power. Restricting the power of the government. The government only gets the power the Constitution limits it to. So the Constitution says, these are the things the government is allowed to do. Everything else, like we learned last week with the amendments, everything else belongs to the people or the states. The federal government only has certain things they get to do. Sorry about that. All right. Government leaders are not above the law. We talked about, because it was the news of the time, the impeachment of the president. They were saying he had broken the law, and because of limited government, he doesn't get to do that. They, of course, found him not guilty in the impeachment, in case you don't remember that. But the reality is, nobody gets to break the law and do whatever they want, because the Constitution says you have limits on what you're allowed to do. We can find that in Articles 1, 2, and 3 of the Constitution. Separation of powers. We have talked about this. You guys all know this. There are 3 branches of government. Each one has their own power and their own responsibility. So we have the legislative branch right here. That's our Capitol building. That's where they make the laws. The legislature writes the laws. We have 2 parts because we have a bicameral legislature. House of Representatives and the Senate. This was that 3/5 compromise. I'm sorry, not 3/5. I don't know why I said that. This was that compromise of the New Jersey plan and the Virginia plan. The executive branch. We think of that as the president and the vice president, but it's really anybody who enforces the laws. So there's a lot of parts to the federal government that is the executive branch, but they enforce the laws. Then we have the judicial branch. Think of that like the Supreme Court, the very top of it. The judicial branch's job is to interpret the laws. So here's how this works. And then they're found in the first 3 articles of the Constitution. So let's say the legislature says, we want to make it a crime to not go to church on Sunday. We think that should be a rule. We're going to make it a law. And they write this law and they pass this law. And that's the legislative branch's job. The executive branch's job is, you wrote a law. I may not like the law, but you wrote the law, so I have to follow the law. The judicial branch is if somebody says, hey, this law is not constitutional, and I was arrested or fined or punished for breaking this law. So now I'm going to sue these people, not necessarily president and vice president, could be the police department, could be the district attorney, or people versus the state of Texas or something. But I'm going to sue the judicial branch and say, hey, it's against the Constitution. You can't tell me I have to go to church on Sunday. And the Supreme Court looks at the law and they interpret what was the law saying and is it constitutional. If it's not constitutional, no more law. So here's the next thing that we're going to talk about. That brings us to checks and balances. We have separation of powers, which divided us into 3 independent branches. This piece, which are accountable to each other, that's the checks and balances part. It's found in Articles 1, 2, and 3 that set up the 3 branches. So our U.S. government kind of looks like this. We have these 3 parts. Back to our law example. So they've written a law here. If the president, executive branch, looks at that law and says, hey, that's not okay, I'm not going to sign that law, that is a check on the power of the legislative branch. He said, stop, check yourself, this is not okay. You can't do it. And he just doesn't sign it. Now, let's say the legislative branch says, well, almost everybody here, 90% of the people here voted yes. So we're going to vote again. And if we get enough votes, it's a law anyway. So that's how they keep the president's power in check. So that the president can't take something that's a good law that everybody wants and say, well, I don't like it and I don't like you, so I'm not going to sign the law. That's a check on his power or her power when we get a female president. Then let's say both of these guys are in cahoots like we talked about. They both say this is a good law. You're going to have to go to church on Sunday. The judicial branch checks that law and says, that's against the Constitution. That's freedom of religion. You don't have to go to church. We can't tell somebody to go to church. So they declare the law unconstitutional, and now the law doesn't exist anymore. If these guys want to check the judicial branch, they got to write a new law. So sometimes they can check it by lower levels. The Supreme Court's kind of the end of the road for all the things, but let's say a district court, which is a different level, does something which you think is unconstitutional, you can then take it up a notch and go to the person above them or go to the court above them. So those are the only principles we're going to talk about today. Let's go through them again. Please let's sign constitutions faster, Rhode Island. So we did please let's sign constitutions. Popular sovereignty, limited government, separation of powers, checks and balances. All of these were about let's not make this a government where all the power lies in the federal government. They'd had enough of that with the monarchy, which is why we got rid of it. So popular sovereignty, power to the people. Limited government, nobody's above the law. There are restrictions on what the government can do. Separation of powers, 3 branches of government, each with separate powers and responsibilities. They all have something different they do. But to make sure nobody has too much power, we have the checks and balances. These are all found directly in the Constitution. We can tie them back to each piece of the Constitution. All right, so that's it for today. On Wednesday, we're going to finish out the principles. We'll discuss federalism, republicanism, individual rights, and then I'll talk to you about a couple more things. You do have a Google form that you need to fill out, so make sure you take care of that. Guys, you are halfway through summer school. There are a lot of you not doing any work at all. Please remember you have to do that. It's a rule. This is an obligation that you have, so please take care of business. I will talk to you guys on Wednesday.